I think there's a whole bunch going on that we're just not really aware of. And that I think I'd love it if people became more interested in the systems that are being put in place rather than thinking that certain people are going to come and save us. And just become very aware of the systems that are going on. Because I mean, I'm very concerned about the technocratic systems. I'm very concerned about the surveillance and the ID and the synthetic food and whatever else. And I'm concerned about the Internet of Bodies and the monitoring of our bodies. And there's so much I'm concerned about. But I think until people understand the systems that are being put in place, you're going to just fall for the theatrics, the theatrics over the top.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Collapse Life. I'm Zara Sethna, and I'm so happy to host this weekly look at life in a turbulent and changing world. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, please hit that button now. Thank you so much. We take a global view here at Collapse Life because we know the pressures on our freedoms don't respect borders. Today, we're diving into Australia, a place that sometimes feels like a test lab for some of the most invasive globalist ideas out there. We're excited to welcome Kate Mason, a researcher who has been exposing some chilling moves on the ground. Australia's story could be a warning for all of us, so we're very eager to learn what's at stake and what we might be able to do about it. So, Kate, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Zara. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, welcome. Let's jump right in. As I said, it sometimes feels as though Australia, among other countries, is a bit of an incubator for some kind of insidious ideas from the globalists, like lockdowns and digital IDs and things like that, deregulation of genetically edited food. So, correct me if I'm wrong. If you think that that's not the case, and if so, how did we kind of arrive there? What happened?
Well, definitely Melbourne, Victoria in Australia was the longest lockdown city state in the world. So you can say that we did have more extreme measures put in place in some areas of Australia. There was a very high amount of people that went. So if we're just talking about COVID and the COVID measures, there was a very high percentage of the population that went along with what was happening and didn't question it. So there is a bigger. I do believe from talking to Americans. I haven't been to America, but from talking to Americans, I think America does have more of a focus on the individual, where
Mhm.
Australians seem to be very. If you can frame something as for the common good, people will sacrifice. So we see this all over the place. Like I think it was last year and the year before, bees were killed in New South Wales, where I'm from, so one of the states. So the government said, "For all mites here, we have to kill the bees." And they just went on in these 10-kilometre patches, killing everyone's bees till billions and billions of bees were killed. And because everything's couched, and if we don't do this, it's going to cost more. It's going to be worse if we don't sacrifice these amounts of bees. It'll be worse. They're doing the same in Queensland at the moment. They're poisoning people's properties and dropping chemicals from airplanes and drones into the bush to kill fire ants, because if we don't kill these fire ants, it's going to be worse. Now, so
Mm.
it's always the same story. Same as COVID, when the measures that are so destructive don't work, like the COVID measures that didn't work because everyone still got COVID or something, and then the killing the bees did not stop this tiny mite. And then the government says, oopsie, we actually knew it had been here 2 years prior in one tiny little article after they've killed everyone's bees. Or they're trying to, poison land to kill fire ants, and it's not going to work and kill every last fire ant. There's no transparency. People don't get outraged. People don't go, well, we did it for the common good, and yet this has turned into a farce. So there's
Mm.
some real, even though it's for the common good, there's some real disconnect for people. I actually think we have a very complacent population, to be honest, after 3 or 4 years of trying to work out the shock. I was so shocked by the Australian public and what they did. And I've been trying to work it out for 4 years
Yeah.
psychologically what happened. And I come down to this sort of utter complacency on behalf of
Mhm.
people. They kind of care enough, but not really. There's just a virtue signaling aspect to it, but not a genuine
Right.
where you really get involved and you really see it through.
Right. We were talking off camera. We were living in Canada in the first few years of the COVID era, And we found a very similar thing there. There's a complacency, there's a desire to kind of everyone to be conforming, everyone to be doing what is seen to be the right thing, whatever that may be. We don't define that for ourselves. We let other people define it, and then everybody just goes along. Um, but that sense of the lack of outrage, that's the piece that surprises me, that even when shown that a harm has been done to you, people don't get outraged. They still find a way to rationalize it in their mind and say, oh well, it was, I mean, because in a way it's hard to argue against a group of people who want to do something for the common good. There's definitely some benefit to that if we all did what was best for ourselves, even at the expense of harming other people. That's not the right way to kind of build a society. But yeah, that lack of outrage is just a surprising piece in the current era.
Yeah, there's no definition, there's no analysis of who's defining the common good, what
Mm,
their interests are. Are they benefiting from, are they benefiting in any way, shape, or form from the procedures that are being put in place and the policies that are being put in place? And what's
yeah.
the transfer of wealth? Because there's a transfer of wealth each time these measures are put in place, from COVID down to killing bees. There's a transfer, there's a, like you could see the biosecurity threats that are constantly coming in now in Australia. So you've got to cull chickens, you've got to cull
Mm,
bees, you've got to, really damage the earth for fire ants, etc. That's only the last couple of years.
mm,
There was the tomato virus threat. I mean, the World Health Organization, there's about 4 organizations that are involved with the UN. They got together and created a MOU. It's a four-party system around biosecurity threats. And so then you look at, well, a lot of the people invested in the WHO or the United Nations are invested in synthetic food. So, like
right.
there's even that complacency to kind of push this to, okay, so if we're going to follow this common good global agenda, let's look at who's
Mhm.
paying for that, who's funding for that, to see if their interests are being met through any of these policies being implemented.
And so when you say invested, it's not emotionally invested. It's literally financially gaining from killing off an organic food source and bringing in a synthetic
Yeah.
food source.
Yeah, you can trace that back and make that argument with some of the funders.
And
Well,
when
like
you
the Bill
do
and
make
Melinda
that
Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller-Fundation, they
right,
fund, the WHO, and they're involved in synthetic biology and
right.
GMOs.
When you do make that argument to people, do you find that they actually push back against the truth that you're showing them?
No, I find that people just go silent. So, this is the issue, isn't it? Like, to actually prove all of this takes a long time. And I'm not saying I'm the only, I mean, lots of people
Mm,
research, and they really research down to try to get to really the crux of the matter. But you can't explain, I mean, you can kind of explain that in 2 lines, but people have to accept that you know what you're talking about. Otherwise, you've got to prove it and prove every step of the way. So, no, I feel like I can say it, and I've got the Substack articles where I really do go through and pull out articles and reports and, these paragraphs. But I find if we're just talking about people who aren't that aware, I don't think it really makes much difference. I'm still confused as to what happens for people.
mm. It's probably a little bit of Matthias Desmet's theory of you know, the crowd mentality and people just being um, uh, almost hypnotized, right? Brainwashed.
It's
Um,
actually very hard as well. It's like jumping off a cliff once you start to, move through this. It's not an easy process by any means. You have to be very brave and sort
yes.
of, take a big step.
One of the things that you've been writing about on your Substack recently is this idea of managed retreat as a response to climate change. So, can you explain a little bit about what that means? You can kind of maybe showcase the common good narrative that's been built, but then what it actually means to people and their property.
Well, managed retreat is the removal of homes and infrastructure away from areas that are deemed too high risk. So this is big. So if you just look at Managed Retreat USA, you will find lots and lots of articles. Or Managed Retreat Canada. I was listening to some women in Kapiti in New Zealand, and the whole town of Kapiti is looking at managed retreat. So they're removing homes. You just lose your properties, basically. The government over there is a little bit more advanced in New Zealand. So they've sort of got think tanks and papers being written about how people are going to be compensated. And we're talking about the IPCC, the climate change, the United Nations panel on climate change. So they've put out scenarios for the year 2100, I think it is. If there's different pathways. So they've done estimations and modelling of, if no one does anything about greenhouse gas emissions, this is how much the ocean's going to rise, this is how much the world's going to warm. And then they've got different pathways. So 8.5 is the most extreme, and then others are less extreme. The governments around the world are using the most extreme model, and they're saying, based on this extreme model, this area in another 180 years is going to be unlivable. So we need to make changes preemptively to this area, rather than, we cannot afford the risk and the costs of cleanups and people's insurance. To pay out people, how are the insurance companies going to pay out this much amount? So we have to proactively, before a disaster hits, move people off their land and their houses. And so in New South Wales, where I am, the government put out a paper last year. It was a disaster mitigation plan. And in that, they talk about managed retreat, and they say a widespread managed retreat policy will be out this year, released by the government. So you've got a whole bunch of things coming in. So I'd like to talk. So you've got to talk about all the different. There's quite a few components that I've unpacked, which lead to massive threats to private home ownership. So I'd like to talk more, because it's like you can't talk about one without sort of putting the whole bigger picture, which is where it becomes quite alarming.
Yes. Yeah. I would love to have you unpack all of that as you see fit. Tell the story
Okay.
in
So
the way.
you've got the managed retreat, and what they're doing at the moment is they're modelling, and they're saying, so my area, they put modelling every different area. So your federal election areas, and they say, this is your ranking for fire, this is your ranking for flooding, this is your ranking for earthquakes or tsunamis or heat waves. I'm not sure if heat waves is in there, but there's about 7 different things. And then they go, you got a rating of this, this, and this. They compile all of that together and give you a score for your area. And that's how much at risk you are of climate change. And that's also, and population growth is another thing. So if you have more population growth in your area, you're also more at risk of, these risks in the future. So they're also bringing massive migration into Australia and packing people into areas that they're saying are climate sensitive as well. So they're cutting down trees all over the place in environmentally protected areas as well. So, there's all this messaging, and it does not tee up into anything congruent. So you've got that affects insurance. So, there's a report I found on the World Economic Forum, but it's from an Australian Climate Council, I think it was, when 1 in 25 homes in Australia are uninsurable by 2030. So one of the things they might do, they might come in and say, look, this area, there are these threats that are going to happen in the future. So we need to put in this sort of infrastructure, but we need triggers to say when there would be managed retreat. That it's not going to work. We need to do managed retreat. One of the triggers that's been talked about is if too many people can't afford to insure their homes. So that might trigger managed retreat, because if a disaster happened and people weren't insured, it's going to be a calamity. We can't afford that calamity, so we have to move you preemptively. And in 2022, the New South Wales government put through legislation, the Reconstruction Act, and they basically they have the legislation now to take your land based on preemptive modelling, or based on the minister saying this area is potentially a climate issue or a hazard. Too much hazard. They can take your land, they can do what they want with your land, and they can on-sell your land. And that's also through, they talk also about that being lack of ability to get water insecurity, or poisons, too much poisons in the soil, or, whatever else. So, and at the same time, I'm not quite sure if this is right, in my thinking. I'm trying to put things together, but I'm like, well, they're actually actively poisoning the soil a lot and the land a lot
Right.
around us. So you've got that aspect of it. You've got that legislation sitting there waiting. You've got the widespread managed retreat policy coming out this year. At the same time, you have from this New South Wales Reconstruction Fund that they created, or this body, they've asked the local councils, so we've got local councils, to start doing climate disaster adaptation plans for each area. So now it's like going down locally. So this year, the councils will bring out disaster adaptation plans. How are they going to adapt to disasters? So all of that's really moving along very quickly. Now, at the same time, so what we're going to have is we're going to have climate overlays. And this is talked about in different reports. We're going to have climate overlays. So not only your house will have a certificate saying this is the climate risk of this house, your area will have a climate overlay as well. It's going to affect how much you can sell your house for if your house is suddenly, risky. So that's all coming in. Now, a lot of this we have Resilient Sydney in Sydney, so I'm near Sydney, and you've got Resilient Melbourne. That's Rockefeller-funded. And so they've got a lot of reports. They're really involved in all of this, as well as the Committee for Sydney, which is has partnerships with I can't remember the name, but it's a global cities company that has partnerships with the World Economic Forum. And so we've got all the global players in here in our area.
Yeah.
Putting out their reports that the government then puts out 2 or 3 years later, very similarly worded reports as to these private committees who are also involved with our local councils. So they're kind of captured. So there's this whole coming out this way. Now, we've also got in Australia federally this year, they're going to start putting housing. So, how, I don't know, in Australia, we have like stars on our fridges and things to say the energy ratings.
Right.
They're going to do that for houses this year. So up till now, they've had it for new houses. You had to have a 7-star energy rating for your house. Now it's going to go on existing houses. So they say in the reports, the majority of houses in Australia are at a 1.8 star for energy rating, and they want us to get up to 5.
So they're going to force people to replace windows, put in heat pumps, change their roofing, that kind of thing?
Yeah, change the color of the house. I don't know exactly the things that would come together to get to 5, because they're talking about 5-star, starting at 5-star, but that will incrementally increase as technology progresses. And Scotland's already they've already said 2030. This is a global agenda as well. 2033 in Scotland, you will have to do it. You just have to do it. But in Australia, it will come in at point of sale. So when you go to sell your house, you'll have like an energy rating on your house. And if you want to rent a property, you'll have to have it up to a certain energy rating. So that's going to put more pressure. I don't like that, people have to rent substandard housing. I'm not saying that. Same time, we're in a housing crisis like we are all around the world, and that's going to create more of a housing crisis. So that's basically it. So 5 stars, that's what they're talking about. People will have to get it up. So what we're looking at, what I can see is this perfect storm of, you've got your house, you suddenly find out you're in a really climate sensitive area where they're talking about maybe we'll have to do managed retreat in the future. We might try a few things, but we'll have to do managed retreat. So you've got that as hanging over your head, and that will come into people's consciousness pretty soon. So people aren't going to want to buy houses that are in areas, or only if they've got a lot of money and they can really, so you've got the wealthy, I guess, can snaffle the houses up. Then you've got, but you're going to have to do these costly upgrades to sell it for anything, anything that's an amount of money. Otherwise, you're going to sell it really cheaply with the upgrades. So you've got a whole bunch of uncertainty around home ownership coming in this year, basically hitting people from all sides.
And you can sell it if it's still insurable, but if you're saying that they're estimating that 40% of homes will be uninsurable in the next 5 years. So if your house is uninsurable,
1 in 25, 1 in 25.
1 in 25. Right.
But I don't think that's right. I think it's going to be a lot more than that, because insurance is going up hugely. People are getting like 10 grand, 12 grand, 15 grand quotes for insurance now. Like, people can't afford it already.
Right.
And and this is before all of this, is going to come in, and people are going to, the insurance companies are going to really ramp this up.
Right. And so, for most people, I'm sure in Australia it's the same as in Canada or in the United States, your home is your biggest investment. And now you have this fear that your home isn't up to standard, you're going to be fine. Well, so if you're at a 1.8 and you don't go up to a 5, that only matters if you want to sell your
At
home.
the
Will they come
moment,
and
this
yeah,
is incremental. This is incremental. So yeah,
exactly. That's
right
it. Yeah.
now it's one point, and they're saying just, I mean, maybe they've gone on and said it's more. I haven't looked at any of this year. I've been taking a little bit
Mhm.
of just a break to get my head back. But yeah, so they're saying they just put forward the possibility of 5. But if you go and read the documents and the organisation that's the New South Wales government, or the federal government's actually talking about, so there's an organisation behind this that are the ones who are the think tank for all of this. They're talking
Yeah.
about disaster resilient homes. So not just energy ratings, and to have an energy rating, you have to have a good energy rating. You also have to have solar, and I reckon they'll say smart meters and things like that will have to be
Mhm,
used
mhm.
for sure. So you get pushed into certain technologies you may not want to use.
Yeah.
So there's that, but they're also talking about disaster resilient housing. So it's not going to stop at the 5-star or whatever they come up. That'll just be the start. Then it'll become like, okay, so you shouldn't have windows on this side of your house. If you start to look at what a house that's a number 10, you basically got to knock down houses and build them again.
Yeah.
Or if you look at real disaster resilient houses, most houses would have to be knocked down. But that's what they're talking about if you look at the documents behind
Mhm.
the Australian government's document.
So is the underlying plan then to just move people out of private home ownership and into um, a more managed housing, so into cities that become smart cities and nobody can own their own private property anymore?
I think I'm not sure if I mean, this is only my guess, like it's not spelt out anywhere at the moment, but I definitely think it's to move us into resilient housing, smart housing, like with all the, sensors and the sensors and the AI governance and, as in a smart city, definitely for that. I think that's why they're doing so much building. That's my, other people, I think that's actually one of the reasons Australia, they've changed the guidelines. You can now pack and stack a lot more than you could before, so
Mm,
go up high, you can go down. It'll be everywhere around the world. This is a global agenda as well.
mhm.
So I do think that's part of it, that it's going to become, I mean, even if you just look at the most basic level, there's going to be a whole bunch of people that are forced out of the market just through, because the other aspect of it is, I forgot to mention this, is that infrastructure is going to become more and more privatized. So
Right.
Australia, and this would be similar probably to Canada and the USA, we're at the end of our infrastructure life for roads, for sewerage, for all these things that were put in 20, 30 years ago. They all need an upgrade.
Mhm.
Then you've got the digital infrastructure that needs to come in to monitor us and put the smart technology through everything, and the, data centers and, everything else that needs to happen for that infrastructure. So you've got all of that. Governments are broke. Governments all around the world have made themselves broke.
Yeah.
So then you've got BlackRock. This is just one example. BlackRock buying global infrastructure partners, saying governments are broke all around the world. The next big boon in private investment is going to be infrastructure.
Mhm.
So then you've got, and then it does say this in one of the Committee for Sydney reports around managed retreat. They talk about infrastructure companies will be deciding where they want to keep infrastructure up to.
Right.
So you've got infrastructure companies saying, look, it's not really worth our while to upgrade all of this for this many people living in this area, or maybe we can, and this is just my thinking, or maybe we can do it, but you've got to pay an exorbitant amount. So you've got to be just because the filthy rich, the really, really wealthy are going to live wherever they want to live. That's
Right.
not under question. So they're going to find some loophole that allows them to do that. So there might be just that it's just so expensive that really very few can do it, live in the nice areas.
Right.
Yeah, so that's pretty much. Oh, and the Committee for Sydney report actually talks about, we need to move communities together because communities are so important to each other. And this common good community, like fake community sort of narrative. We have
Yeah.
to move you together, which of course implies that you're moved into some ready-made complex. And
Mhm.
we're not talking
Yeah.
about areas that are just, we're not talking about areas that were just built, should never have been built on. They are in, or they've changed and built around it. So they've created these problems that, end up in a certain street or a certain couple of streets. It's much more of an open slather than that. It's an open thing. And even Rockefeller, like they've, really behind a lot of this, that you can read their papers, but even the way risk is now talked about, I just want to read you what they say about, so they've got the City Resilience Framework in 2014, Rockefeller. Resilience moves away from traditional disaster risk management, so that is risk assessments on specific hazards, to accepting the possibility that a wide range of stresses and shocks may occur but are not predictable. So we're moving from a time of, okay, you live near the bush, we need to sort of mitigate this bush and, whatever else, to climate change is just so full on. It's a wicked problem. That's what they call it, a wicked problem, because we don't know what it's going to look like, how it's going to manifest, what it's going to be. So you've just got to preemptively be resilient. And
Right. It's so wild and unpredictable. Anything can happen at any moment. So, everywhere is a risk at this point.
yeah, and anywhere in nature. Anywhere in nature. But then you get into the cities, and when you have all the, smart tech and everything, you're going to have all the cyber attacks. And you're going to have, like people, I think, a lot more crime. And, even though there'll be the facial recognition technology and everything else, but it doesn't bring out the best in people being really stacked and packed either.
Sure. But no doubt, I mean, so you already mentioned that the private equity firms are buying into infrastructure companies. We know that they already are buying up huge millions and millions of units of housing. And no doubt that they will have a policing solution and a digital safety solution and all sorts of things that you can just buy a subscription for. So it's basically, I think you've used the word, and I tend to agree. It's basically moving us into a smart digital gulag.
Yeah, Paul Koudnak made that. He's a writer for Winter Oak, and he wrote up my work and used that as a heading. I've never used it, but I think it's relevant. I think it is a digital prison. I mean, it is a digital prison. What's coming, if that's allowed to come in this way, and anyone who doesn't understand. I mean, if you stood up against COVID and you didn't get injected, transfection injection. And you went to the supermarket and you had to do a QR code to get in or whatever else, you know what it's going to look like,
Yeah,
with facial recognition technology and digital ID that can pull up your records through the cameras that have been put up everywhere in the last 3 or 4 years.
that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, what can you tell us about those models, the digital models that they have used to predict the terrible climate risks, and that they've based this entire plan on? What do you know about them?
Well, I know it's the 8.5. It's always the most extreme model that they can get. They use there's quite a lot of climate models. I really would like to look into this a little bit more. There's a number of climate models you can use. So you can use the worst ones for each, you could use, this is the model that's going to show the worst if we don't have no rain for like a number of years. This is the model we're going to use to show what would happen if we had a lot of rain in the next few years. And then you compound the worst of all those models to come up with something really disturbing. So that's basically what it is. So the New South Wales government uses XDI partners, and they partner with the New South Wales government to do the climate modelling. And they want to, this is what they say, our goal is to accelerate action on climate change by embedding physical climate risk data in all decisions. So every decision that's made, and this is what the government says as well, needs to be factoring in this most extreme climate change models. And so they've got XDI's got a sister company, Climate Valuation, and that's where they give homeowners, this is the potential forecast risks of this home for if you want to buy this home.
Mm.
And then they put out lots of reports and warnings, and they're on ABC and, giving warnings about certain areas and everything else. And one of the founders is a bloke called Carl Mullen. And he's also, so as well as doing all this climate change modelling and putting it out around the world, He's also a director of Climate Bonds Initiative. So the Climate Bonds Initiative is an international organization working to mobilize global capital for climate action. So that's a
Mm.
whole nother, the amount of money that's going into climate action and, the different forms of that. Again, something else I need to look at a bit further, but you've got someone who's putting, the worst case scenarios out and garnering the money for the solutions.
It is just mind-boggling how when you start to unpack it, it really comes to, just a handful of people who are profiting on one side, but also the biggest voices of, fear-mongering on the other side. And um, how little people actually pay attention to this is always the surprise that we just sort of say, okay, you want me to stop using plastic straws? That's going to make a big difference. I'll do that. I'll do that. It is amazing how much bigger this picture is. And as you said, it's all tied together. So, where some people might be focused on one issue and not really paying attention to others, but they're all interconnected. So, here in America, for example, we have real IDs being rolled out. So there's a whole conversation about you won't be able to travel domestically without a so-called real ID, even though you can still use your passport. But that's a whole kind of digital ID program, which a lot of people have pushed back against until recently, and some small subset are still pushing back against. And all of those things, as we said, are connected. You're being watched and tracked everywhere you go, and soon there'll be a way of saying you can't go anywhere anymore because you've traveled too much. Um, are those conversations happening in Australia as well?
We've got the digital ID. The digital ID bill went through last year, so it's an act now. It says in there that, it's so interesting. It says in there that it won't be compulsory unless, and then so the part that says it won't be compulsory gets shared by everyone, like, oh, see, it won't be compulsory, but then it's like, unless there's an emergency.
Right.
Unless a small business does it. Unless, it's like basically the three unlesses mean it's completely going to be mandatory, you know.
Yeah.
But the problem is that a lot of people, we don't have any media except for, I think America has better alternative media than Australia does. Um, yeah, so there's because a lot of people, we pay a lot of attention to American politics, but not to Australian politics and not to what the Australian government's actually doing in the legislation. There's too few people looking at the legislation and
Right.
what's actually going through. So yeah, I find that a bit just. I don't like that. I wish we had more Australians actually really hunkering down, trying to work out what's happening with our government.
Yeah, and building up that independent voice, that media voice, or at least supporting those of you who are doing it. Um, the unless there is an emergency is, that's the big one, because we spoke to someone recently, John Whitehead from the Rutherford Institute here in the United States. We were talking about emergency measures, and there's dozens of them still in effect here in America, some of which were um, implemented decades ago, and they're still on the books. So, I don't think people really understand how easy we go about our lives, and we think that we're free to do what we want, buy what we want, go wherever we want. But we don't realize how close we are to that being taken away from us just overnight.
Yeah, that's what the mandates showed. I mean, the Victorian government, they were brutal. They were brutal to the people that stood on the streets. They were really harmed. And yeah, that was really distressing for me to see that. I guess, I mean, people would have known that. Like, it's not the first time people have been brutalized in Australia, but it's the first time I've really seen it. So, yeah, no, it's just like as soon as a disaster comes, um, you know, everything goes out the window. I just want to say also before I forget, the Australian government, the New South Wales government disaster mitigation plan that came out last year says very clearly private business, private interests or private businesses could be used. They could put the money up to help with the with the managed retreat, so to help people move out of their properties because they're made to, and in return they'll get the land. It actually says that, like in
The
black and
state would take over the land.
No, the private companies will be given the land. The private entities can put forward the money to help people relocate, and they'll get the land that's been moved out of in return.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And there would be no recourse for the homeowner? They would have no say, they would just have to do as they're told and take
I think
whatever money
so.
is being handed to them?
Yeah.
I mean, this
Yeah.
is so alarming. This is such a scary story, and it's not science fiction.
And it's sort of like, if I had the time and energy, I'd look at, well, how is this impacted? How much more natural disasters are impacted by changes to how the natural environment is dealt with? Like, is there less backburning now? What sort of policy changes have happened? Is there less, like, is there more dams put in certain areas or less dams? Dams taken out of areas. So there's, people have built near creeks or rivers, and now the dams, whatever dam, because they're taking dams out. And I haven't looked at this too much in Australia as well, but that will cause a lot more water to flow through, and land will be taken. So what I've seen in my looking just for a few years, and I really did a lot around the bees being killed, I see that climate change is blamed for a whole bunch of stuff that's
Mm,
actually government decisions or poisoning. So you can see like people calling and saying climate change is affecting, now there's not as many insects because of climate change. I'm like, there's not as many insects because of the amount of pesticides and poisons that
that's right.
farmers have been using, and the government just puts out of airplanes and puts in the
Yeah.
bush. So many poisons. But that what doesn't get discussed, that's just climate change.
Are there any parts of Australia where managed retreat has already happened?
Um, they're they're doing it at the moment a bit in Lismore in New South Wales. They did some buybacks. It's very slow. It got really flooded out a few years ago. It was pretty horrendous. So
Oh,
there is
wow.
something in place there. And I think there has been a few times this has happened, but it's been more like, I think it's been more like areas that make sense. They probably should
Right.
never have been built on. And it's just become too
Right.
problematic over the years. But
Right.
no, not this, but not widespread. Managed retreat. People in New Zealand are trying to fight back against it in Kapiti. That's where I heard about all of this. In Kapiti is a coastal town, and they're saying you can't, it's not possible to, live there after a while. And people that have lived there said nothing is changing. The ocean is not changing, the sand's not changing, nothing's happening. But still, there's this push to bring in managed retreat there.
So what are they doing to fight back? What lessons can we learn from,
Well,
that
you've got to
example?
go to the council meeting. So there was a couple, they found out, like, in this small community in Kapiti, they found out that and it was the ex-PM of New Zealand as well. The ex-Prime Minister of New Zealand was involved. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but
Mm,
they found out that the meetings were being put on through the council, through one of their subgroups was putting on meetings, community meetings, these, so they had to find out. So then they letterbox dropped and told the community, the people themselves told the community, these meetings are on, because no one was going to them because no one knew they were on. So that's how they
right.
do their community consultations, when no one goes and no one knows it's happening. And then they can, maybe do like 5 people turn up and they just field you through stuff. And I mean, in New South Wales, in my local council, they make you go through smart tech and your smartphones, and then the facilitator reads out the answer so that you don't even get your voice heard. So
Wow.
I think people need to be really. So anyway, the local community actually turned up, and it was like 100 people turned up rather than 3 or 5. And so then it became quite problematic for that council. They've had a lot more pushback, and people
Mhm.
have gone and, talked. They've just made it hard. They've formed groups, they've letterbox dropped, they've put on talks themselves, they've invited the councillors to come to their talks. They've
Mhm.
really questioned this pathway, the RCP 8.5, the IPCC pathway. Why are we using the most extreme pathway that the IPCC itself said was never meant to be for normal use? This was just like worst case scenario, but really not what you should be considering. And that's what everyone's doing. They're using that.
The apocalyptic scenario.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So they just push back. You've just got to push back locally. You have to get enough
yeah.
people who care and actually want to read it's a lot of work, like it'll always be a lot of work for at least a few people to be reading the documents and keeping on top of it and the changes that are coming through.
Yeah. And starting at the local level, it's exactly what John Whitehead from the Rutherford Institute was saying when we were talking about the shift towards totalitarianism as well. Start at the local level, get involved, form your own committee, go to the meetings, run for office if you can. Um, yeah. So, I mean, it's great that that community in New Zealand is doing that. And I wonder what's in the water there that made that happen in that one community.
Mm. Yeah,
Maybe
I
it
think
just takes
someone did
one
too.
special leader, someone with that moxie.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. There wasn't already a group that had been doing something already for a good 10 years, because some other thread had come through about 10. Look, I'm just saying 10 years. It might have been longer or less, but it
Mhm.
was about something similar, and they pushed back and actually took the council to court, I think it was, and won. It was another sort of climate calamity, or that was tried to be pushed through. So they won that one. So there was already a bit of a structure of people and groups and organising in the area, but then a whole bunch more people jumped in this time round.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. We were talking earlier a little bit about synthetic food, and I just wanted to go back to that because it's when it comes to what we put in our bodies and what we eat, there's it's so close. You know, we're so it's so visceral that sometimes um, messing with our food system is where people do sort of push back and say, "No, you can't take away my steak," or "I'm going to eat my eggs," or whatever it is. And at least that seems to happen. There seems to be that line in the sand here in America. Do you find that as well? That is there a growing? We have the MAHA, Make America Healthy Again movement here. Is that something that you feel in Australia as well?
Um, People say no. You're not going to get us to eat fake meat or synthetic meat or whatever else. But I'm just talking more about social media.
Yeah.
What they're doing in Australia. So they've just allowed the first, like last week, the Food Standards Body has just allowed the first synthetic meat to go into the food market in Australia. And I've been following that. That's been going for about a year, going through the Food Standards Body. So we have a Food Standards Body, Australia, New Zealand. So this affects New Zealand as well.
Mm.
So the first lab meat's going through. There's a whole bunch of changes happening in this arena. So the Food Standards Body is changing the definition of GMO, and they're changing the definition of GMO because at the moment, if you want to put a GMO into the market in Australia, you have to go through this very long process. It's got to go out for community consultation
Oh,
twice.
wow.
It's got to be assessed. It's like this massive, laborious process. So we've been quite free of GMOs within Australian produce up till now. To unlock innovation and to not impede innovation, the FSANZ is changing the definition of GMO. So a whole bunch of GMOs will be in our food sources and not be labelled.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they've just had two. I think they've had the second community consultation about this change. Yeah, it's the second one. This change of definition of GMOs. So you will have GMOs in there. There'll be no safety testing, no labelling. It will be an organic food because it's nothing. Like it'll just be there. And
Mm.
so it's got sort of things like I'd have to remember back. I have written quite extensively on it, but all of this is not new. Like this is not my arena. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not like it's not. It's like so hard to understand this, but it's new breeding techniques. That's what it's called. So it's like the CRISPR and the genetic engineering, and they say it mimics nature because evolution will sort of change the genetic structure over time. So we'll just cut some genes out, and it's like nature, you know.
Right. Mother Nature has been modifying genes for millennia. Oh, dear.
That's what they say. Like the arguments are crazy when you go and read them. Or, like we'll genetically edit the root systems of a plant. So say it's an apple tree and does this and it draws down more carbon because a lot of this is coming in under climate change as well and net
Right.
zero. So we'll edit the root systems, but if you eat the apple and the apple part hasn't been genetically edited, or those branches or the twig it comes from, that's not GMO.
No.
So this is what they're saying. So we won't know what's in our food supplies. They've already
No.
allowed one of the CRISPRing, that's the genetic scissors they talk about, to be in
Mhm.
our food source. That happened in 2019. It was STM1 where they just they cut the genes in some way and let it grow back naturally. And that's already in our food supply. And we don't know where it is and what it's doing. But now this is just open slather for
Mm.
biotech. Now, what I think is happening, I looked at COP27, and this is all coming in under the regenerative agriculture.
Right.
So I am I support regenerative farmers in my local area. I know them. They're really just grassroots people who look after the land, look after their animals. Rockefeller hosted the COP27 regenerative agriculture something. I've written a whole article on it, and pulled out the video and looked at the players behind the scenes. So you've got CGIAR, who are
Right.
Rockefeller Gates funded, and they own the seeds. They've taken a lot of the seeds off the world and off the peasants and off the probably I couldn't call them peasants, but people that live on the land and the farmers.
Yeah.
They've taken the seeds and they've housed them. They genetically edit them, and they're going to sell them back as smart seeds, or they already are smart seeds, climate seeds. They need less water. This is, what they say. They need less water. They draw down more carbon into the soil. They're better for the climate. So all of this, what we're going to see is all of this is going to come in as better for the climate. And as farmers are going to have to start to take account of their carbon scores on their farm, we've got a whole synthetic biology discussion going on over here that it's better for the climate. And then we've got we need to know where our farmers' practices are. We need that farm to fork. We need to know how much carbon they're using. Like those
Right.
two things are sitting side by side.
Right.
And regen. So regen farming is where it's going to come in. And again, I want to reiterate, there are genuine regen, but things get co-opted. So on the surface, there'll be no tilling. There'll be certain regen practices, but they're talking about genetically engineering under that biotech and nanotech in the soils.
And then in the greenwashing of it being a sustainable farming practice so people can feel good about it. So they won't label that things are GMO, but of course they'll label, big sunshine logos saying from a sustainable source or from a regen source.
It's so interesting. I was thinking about this yesterday because when the food standards and saying that VAO lab meat can be allowed, it's lab quail from a cell line of a quail. There are when I did a massive, unpacked it and looked at it all. I think it was like 27 reports that we're not allowed to see because it's commercial confidential information. So you're not
No
actually allowed
way.
to see how it's made, what the process is, like there's heaps you can't see in it. So again, you've got this weird, we want to be transparent and accountable. So we have to make farms, account for their carbon scores, but we're going to do synthetic stuff and you won't be able to see anything because that's commercial, confidential information.
Patented. Yeah. We need to know exactly how much methane is coming out of every cow that you have on your farm, but we won't tell you, our patented process for making the Soylent Green. Um, there's so many more things I want to ask you about, but I think we're coming close to the end of our time together for now anyway. So I just wanted to ask you as we sort of come to a close, what other than the things that we've talked about, what do you think are the most overlooked issues, or maybe one or two that you wish that more people in Australia understood?
Okay, so the food. They're changing legislation. They've got draft legislation sitting there at the moment. I would love more Australians to actually connect with this. This is so important. And the genetic editing aspect to what's going on. We haven't talked about this at all, but the social impact bonds that are being created on children, and that's a whole nother story about
Wow.
wealth, because I come from a welfare background, and I didn't realise until I listened to Alison McDowell about and Tashi Sidford in my country, that the welfare system is becoming privatised, and
Wow.
yeah, and the way that this all links into genetics and eugenics as well. So I can't talk about that takes me about 20 minutes to explain that, but I want people to understand that there's a lot hiding under the wellbeing agenda for children in our schools as well. They're getting a lot of surveys and they're being surveyed on their wellbeing, which encroaches on privacy in the home and parents and,
Wow.
the OECD's got their wellbeing surveys and they talk very specifically about parents can be a threat to children's wellbeing. So we need
Oh
to
my
know about
goodness.
the state of parents' relationships. We need to know who the wider networks are for children, et cetera. I find that a really big threat to
Mhm.
families' capacity to parent in the way they want to. And I'm not talking about abuse. I'm not. I'm talking about the realm of a very normal, mix of what happens in families, and that
Mhm.
people should have some privacy. People should be accorded that privacy to
Yeah.
parent the way they want to parent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, We really appreciate all that you're doing, and just remind people how they can follow you and learn more about your incredible research.
Yeah, so I've got a Substack. Just if you search Kate Mason's Substack, there it is on the thing, Kate739 Substack. I don't know how I got that number. Um, I haven't done any Substack articles this year, but I've tried to get ahead of what's happening, and I did a lot. And so there's a lot of articles to get through anyway. And I
Mm.
basically pull out a lot of the government documents and the United Nations documents, Rockefeller documents, and try to work out where we're heading.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for doing it. It's really useful. I know, especially for people in Australia, but for anyone anywhere, it's really useful to look at what Kate has been laying out. So we're really grateful that you came on and spent this time with us, and we do hope that you'll come back and have another chat with us.
Yeah, thank you, Zara.
Thanks so much, Kate. Well, folks, that's a wrap on another eye opening episode of Collapse Life. Huge thanks to Kate Mason for breaking down what's going on in Australia. It really is a wake up call for all of us. And thank you, all of you, for tuning in. If any of this hits home for you, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and share this episode with anyone who needs to hear more. If you want to learn more about us, you can head to collapselife.com and check out our content and sign up for our regular newsletter. It's your lifeline to stay in the know. If you like what we do, you can swing by our Buy Me a Coffee page and support us with either one coffee, 5 coffees, 10 coffees, whatever you feel. We're so grateful for every little bit. Every coffee keeps us fueled to help us track a world that is spinning faster than ever. We'll be back next week and we look forward to seeing you. And until then, just remember, keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.